Well, good afternoon, and thank you for being part of our program today. My name is Cynthia Jones. I serve as chair of my class of the Ninth Circuit Lawyer Representatives for our Western District of Washington, and also serve as the program chair for the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society, who have helped along with the Court of the Western District of Washington sponsor today's program. And I would like to let you know what to expect today. We are going to hear from Chief Judge Martinez for a brief welcome and remarks. And then you'll see a video of the filmmaker, Betsy West, talking about the process of making the film. And then you'll see me again. I'll introduce Beth Bloom, our moderator today, who will in turn introduce the panel and get our discussion going. So without further ado, Chief Judge Martinez, it's all you.
Cynthia, thank you so very much. Welcome to all of you watching and to our very distinguished group of panelists. You know, I can't tell you how disappointed I am that we're not live at the courthouse as we had originally planned to do so, but as I'm sure you're aware, the unrelenting presence of COVID-19 and all the subvariants just made it a bit too risky. COVID has had such a huge impact, on our court's attempt to carry out our constitutional duties, but we're all learning how best to adjust to an ever-changing landscape. Zoom hearings, Zoom trials, criminal trials, of course, would be the most difficult to handle. My most recent trial, just a very short 4-day criminal case, I selected 13 jurors, with an alternate just to be safe. Sure enough, on the morning of arguments, final closings, one juror called in sick. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that the rest of them didn't get infected. But I'm glad we can still get together in this way to listen to our distinguished panelists and their discussion of this amazing film and the life story of an incredible lawyer. I must be honest and confess to you that in my 42 years of being a lawyer and a judge, I had never heard of Pauli Murray. More importantly, of the incredible work done by this gender equality advocate who was instrumental in arguing that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment outlawed discrimination based on sex. I also had no idea how much those persuasive arguments resonated with and influenced two of the greatest jurists of our times, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall. As a nation, I think that mainstream America is just beginning to understand the incredible difficulty that LGBTQ, non-binary, transgender individuals face as they not only struggle with their own identity, but how to fit in with the rest of society that is often overtly not accepting of them. Some recent examples, literally recent examples. Florida's Don't Say Gay law. The Kent School District meeting today to decide whether to follow a recommendation made by a 15-person committee that's already voted 12-3, recommending the banning of books containing LGBTQ+ content in all their middle schools. Seattle Pacific University, right here in Seattle, just their decision earlier this month that bans hiring LGBTQ+ individuals as teachers or any other university employee. And finally, back to Florida, the Tampa Bay Rays Baseball Organization held a Pride Night last Saturday. June is recognized as Pride Month, yet 5 of their players ripped the special Tampa Bay logo, simply displaying rainbow colors, off their uniforms before they were willing to take the field. By the way, the ACLU has already indicated that they are ready to file a lawsuit against this Kent School District if they carry through with their proposed ban. Obviously, many of these cases end up in our federal courts. As lawyers and judges, those of us who work in the justice system have a responsibility to educate ourselves as best we can to any and all potential forms of discrimination if our motto of equal justice for all is to really mean exactly what it says. That's why I know you'll find this panel discussion informative and uplifting. If you have not had a chance to watch the film, please take time to do so. You will learn so much more about the issues and about the passion that drove Pauli Murray. Truly an amazing individual, a lawyer, a poet, an Episcopal priest, in fact, the very first African-American woman to become an Episcopal priest, and obviously a staunch advocate for human rights. In closing, let me thank all of the people who have worked so hard to bring you this presentation today, especially the Federal Bar Association, the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society, Cynthia Jones, Robin Lipsky, Beth Bloom, our moderator, our outstanding group of panelists, including my favorite Washington State Supreme Court Justice. Please keep that amongst between us. I don't want her colleagues to get upset. Let's go to the video.
Good afternoon. We are here with Betsy West, filmmaker and one of the directors of today's topic of discussion, the documentary, My Name is Pauli Murray. Welcome, Betsy. Thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Really happy to be here.
Thank you. So for those in our audience that may not have seen the movie yet, can you tell us a little bit about Pauli Murray and how you came to learn about Pauli?
Yeah, I mean, Pauli Murray may be one of the most extraordinary people of the 20th century who you've never heard of. Pauli was an activist, a lawyer, someone who had a profound impact on both Thurgood Marshall in his civil rights arguments and reasoning, and also Ruth Bader Ginsburg in fighting for women's rights. Pauli was a poet, a published poet, a memoirist, and toward the end of life, the first female identified African-American Episcopal priest. I mean, it's an extraordinary life spanning from 1910 to 1985. And, you know, we first heard about Pauli actually from Justice Ginsburg when we were making our film RBG.
Oh, interesting. So
Yeah.
You've touched a little bit on this, but any more that you want to add about the how and the why you came to make this film?
Yeah, well, when we were making RBG, we learned that Pauli had written a very innovative article in the mid-1960s arguing that in lieu of an equal rights amendment, which was stalled and continues to be stalled, that lawyers could argue for equality, gender equality, under the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. And when Pauli wrote that in the mid-60s with a co-author, that was actually a kind of radical idea. And one of the articles that Ruth Bader Ginsburg read in the late 60s as she was thinking about taking on this project of the Women's Rights Project, in which she was going to argue for equality and against all of the regulations and the laws and the rules that discriminated against women. And so, you know, Justice Ginsburg in later years would often talk about Pauli as having been a very influential person. So then after RBG was finished, we thought, gee, you know, we didn't know anything about Pauli, and we started Googling around and discovered that toward the end of life, Pauli had done a whole bunch of audio interviews. When Pauli became an Episcopal priest, there was interest in Pauli, and so there was some material out there. We thought, well, maybe there's enough to make a documentary. And as we learned more about her life, we were just completely committed. Somebody has to tell Pauli's story as a documentary. There had been books, there had been articles, you know, African-American scholars, especially African-American female scholars, had done a lot on Pauli, and there was a wonderful biography that had been done, but there really hadn't been, you know, a definitive doc. So we thought, why not?
And quite a film it is. Hats off to you on such a success. And talking about Pauli herself and talking about pronouns, I just used a pronoun herself, but maybe that's not right. How does one refer to Pauli?
Yeah, I mean, this is a real question that we struggled with, because it turns out that in looking at the voluminous archive that Pauli donated to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, we discovered, and others had discovered, that Pauli had a real private struggle. In Pauli's 30s and 40s, Pauli was consulting with doctors and asking and saying, look, people say I'm a woman, I feel I'm a man. And this, can you do something? Can you help me? This was at a time when we didn't really have a language. We didn't have an understanding. There was no trans community. Paulie was really alone in trying to figure this out. So ultimately, doctors really rebuffed Paulie, and Paulie went on to have what many would consider a lesbian relationship with another woman. Was not particularly public, and yet Paulie's close friends knew about it. I think we felt that Paulie, we just don't know how Paulie would refer to Paulie. We don't know if Paulie would use male pronouns, or he or they, in this current environment. So Julie Cohen and I, my directing partner, and our producer, all of us who've been working on this, kind of came to the conclusion that we would call Paulie Paulie as much as possible, But we will say that when people refer to Paulie as they or she or whatever, and I think that's fine. We just don't know what Paulie would think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The LGBT community does look at Paulie sort of as a beacon, you might say.
Absolutely.
And yeah, especially the trans community. So what did Paulie write about these issues?
Well, as I said, there were letters to doctors asking for help with this issue, asking perhaps I could get hormones. I've heard that, people have been helped to become more masculine with testosterone. Could that help me? And Paulie did write about what to Paulie's Aunt Pauline wrote about a kind of boy girl personality. So there was some communication, but very limited. And Paulie never really wrote publicly about this issue. So, and yet all of the work that Paulie did for gender equality really helped underscore some of the later gains that the LGBTQ community has made legally with, marriage equality and others. That's really on a foundation of work that Pauli Murray did.
Mm-hmm. I understand when you set out to make the film, Pauli Murray, Paulie had passed away some 3 decades earlier. Yeah. What are some of the challenges you faced in making a documentary, not just about someone who had passed 30 years prior, but also who hadn't been a big public figure?
Yeah, I mean, even though Paulie didn't get the recognition in Paulie's lifetime that we might think Paulie deserved, Paulie had a real sense of history and of Paulie's place in history, and so saved everything. As I mentioned before, Paulie gave a lot of material to the Schlesinger Library, around 150 boxes of material. Paulie had saved photographs, letters, diaries, and then had done these audio interviews in which Paulie would record the interviewers so that Paulie would have a copy of it. You get the sense in the archive that Paulie was putting all of this here for later generations, for a time when people would understand and appreciate Paulie's experience. So we have to credit Pauli Murray for the ability to be able to use Paulie's voice and try to tell the story as much as possible in Paulie's own words. That was the challenge.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think she is not better known? I think your documentaries will go a long way to remedy that, but what's your thought on that?
It's a complex question. I think there's no question that there was racism in the women's movement, misogyny in the civil rights movement, in the sense that, credit was not given to women like Paulie. And I think also the women's movement didn't pay enough attention to the concerns of African-American women. But I think, so that's there. And then perhaps there was an unease with Paulie's identity. that people had, a sense that, this person's a little different. Paulie did dress sometimes in a masculine way, and that may have somehow impeded Paulie becoming more of the civil rights or the women's rights movements. But, I also think that it was Paulie who kind of didn't stick around to get credit for things. Paulie comes up with this amazing idea of Jane Crow, which is that Paulie really suffered both discrimination as an African American and discrimination as a person identified as a woman. I mean, that's a really amazing intersectionality, like, 50, 60 years ahead of time. But it was like Paulie was always moving on to the next thing. There was a kind of restlessness, so that Paulie makes the contributions to Thurgood Marshall's arguments and Brown v. Board of Education. Paulie gets a job in a law firm, and the next thing you know is going to Africa to help start a law school in Africa, comes back and really digs into the women's movement, and then ultimately turns to spirituality. So there is a sense that Paulie was a restless person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for your commentary today and introducing the film. And before we let you go, could I ask what's been the reaction to the film?
It's been really gratifying that the film was picked up by Amazon Studios, which means that it's available to people who have Amazon and can see it. That gets it to a broader audience that might not have read the wonderful biographies that have been written about Paulie. I mean, I encourage people to read those biographies, and also Paulie's own writing, which has been republished in recent years, the family memoir and poetry collections. The other thing that's happened is, recognition for the film winning a DuPont award, getting nominated for a Peabody. All of those things lead people to say, gee, who was this Pauli Murray? And the Pauli Murray Foundation in North Carolina just got a very large grant. And I don't know if that was directly as a result of this, but I think it's all of this kind of re-examination of our history, re-examination of who the people are who've made a difference in our world, Pauli Murray included, has led to perhaps a recalibration and a sense that, Pauli Murray is having a day.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you, Betsy West. She is one of the directors of My Name is Pauli Murray and a filmmaker. And we appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you for organizing this event. It's great. Just part of the rediscovery of Pauli Murray. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you. And I would like to also mention that since the conversation with Betsy West, the American Bar Association has honored the documentary with its Silver Gavel Award for 2022, and that will be bestowed on July 12th in Washington, D.C. And that Silver Gavel Award recognizes work that fosters further understanding of the law and the public's knowledge of the law. So without further ado, let's get to the substantive conversation. And with us today to moderate our panel is a very well-regarded and amazing lawyer in our own legal community in the Western District of Washington, Beth Bloom. Beth is an employment trial lawyer, and she represents employees in workplace discrimination in trials, including on the basis of race and gender and sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. Beth is a founder of Q Law, the LGBTQ+ Washington State Bar Association, and she's a former spokesperson for the National LGBTQ Task Force, a social justice advocacy nonprofit. So without further ado, welcome Beth, and thank you for being here today to moderate our panel.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. What a lovely introduction. It is my absolute privilege and honor to be here to moderate a panel about Pauli Murray, and in the spirit of Pauli Murray, I want to introduce our panelists. First and foremost, we have with us Justice Yu, who was appointed to the Washington Supreme Court in May 2014 and was then elected in 2014 and 2016. She is currently running without an opponent for re-election this fall. Justice Yu joined the Supreme Court after 14 years as a King County Superior Court judge and has an extensive record of service both on and off the bench, including being an incredible mentor for many young people, lawyers, and law clerks and students. I count myself among her many lucky mentees. And one other thing I want you to know about Justice Yu is that she is the first Asian, the first Latina, and the first member of the LGBTQ community to serve on the Washington State Supreme Court. And that is a court that has actually become the most diverse court in the nation, with 7 women and 2 men of multiple racial and cultural backgrounds. And we are just pleased as punch to have Justice Mary Yu with us here this afternoon. Hello. Next, I want to introduce Anthony E. Varona. He is the Dean Designate and Professor of Law at Seattle University School of Law. He starts his new job, I think, in a matter of weeks on July 1st. Professor Varona was for 14 years a professor at American University Washington College of Law. He is an award-winning scholar, including in the areas of sexuality and gender law. He is served as the Dean at the University of Miami School of Law in 2019 and 2021, and most recently as Dean Emeritus there. And if that weren't enough, he also is the former first general counsel and legal director for the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBTQIA+ advocacy group in the United States. So welcome, Dean Varona. And then finally, it's also my pleasure to introduce to you Amrita Mallik. She is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The DEI officer is a newly created position, so still has that new position smell. And she has been at the job since November 2020. In that role, she is developing DEI programs for court employees and parties who appear in court within the Ninth Circuit. She's previously been a diversity expert in the University of Hawaii, and before that she was a senior trial lawyer after my own heart at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and she'll be sure to share with us some of the exciting developments that the Ninth Circuit has been pushing, particularly around issues of gender. So without further ado, welcome panelists. Can everybody come off of mute so we can have a lively discussion? Hello. Can everybody hear me?
Hello, everybody.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Oh my goodness, what a treat. Well, let's jump right in and talk about reactions to the film, first of all. I think we've agreed that our goal here is to have a lively discussion about diversity and equity and inclusion, and one that Pauli Murray themselves would wish that they could attend and would feel affirmed and believe that their spirit is being carried forward in the work that we are doing today, and specifically that the 3 of you are doing today. So in talking about the film, as Betsy West points out, Pauli Murray is a non-binary, queer, African-American lawyer, scholar, poet, and priest. Pauli's life work was to really push us as a country to deliver on this promise of human rights, right? We have these words that are written in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, and Pauli's view of it was that we needed to do more to push the country to be what it is the country promised to be when it came to equal protection under the law. Pauli's practice area was human rights and was based on the essential belief that their work was to push back on these inherent dominated beliefs in society that Blacks are inferior to whites and that women are inferior to men. And Pauli viewed the discrimination in the world as a moral challenge, one that was moral and spiritual. And my question to you to begin is, whoever wants to go first, is what was your reaction to the film? Did you see yourself in any way in the film? And what are you doing to carry Pauli Murray's legacy forward? Even if perhaps you didn't know that you were carrying Pauli Murray's legacy forward. Who would like to begin?
We're all going to be really shy.
Well, I count on you, Justice Mary, to break the ice. So why don't you start? Reactions to the film and how you see your life connected to Pauli's.
Well, first, thank you, Beth. You know, my first reaction was sadness to the extent that I did not know, right, the story of Pauli Murray. And I now recognize how, frankly, I'm probably an intellectual midget because I didn't, in the sense that here was this remarkable scholar who had so much to say, frankly, to us about being who we are. And, you know, it doesn't take much when after you see the film to really reflect on the things even that the chief mentioned in his comments, right in our backyard. We have examples of people who want to stomp out the reality that perhaps the new invisible person needs to be the lesbian, right, or the trans individual. So there's this conscious effort still to silence, to remove, and to erase. And if there's any way that any of us can keep the wisdom and experience of Pauli Murray alive, for me as a judge, is to write. Just look for Pauli Murray in future court opinions. I think a footnote here and there, a citation here and there might begin to make all the difference. And what she did, or he did, or they did is something that I have to continue to think about and committed to, and that is speak to a future generation. When we write a dissent, we're writing to another generation, to another court, to somebody else.
Wonderful. Well, you heard it here first. Look in the footnotes of the Washington Supreme Court opinions. That's the tip. Amrita, would you want to speak about your reactions to the film and how you're carrying the legacy forward?
Absolutely. You know, just like Justice it was sadness, but also a bit of a revelation. You know, I was a civil rights scholar, I was a civil rights practitioner, and now I do DEI work, and I'd never heard of this individual who was so foundational and contributed in really profound ways to the work that we do and the ways that we now see the world and almost take for granted. I felt like those students at Rutgers were like, how did I not know about this person and their incredible dopeness, right? So there is that, and I sincerely thank the filmmakers, and I certainly want to go read The Firebrand and The First Lady in the Firebrand, and thank you to the audience for suggesting that as well. I think one thing that I really wanted to highlight too was the moral aspect of it, and the fact that, you know, sometimes that gets lost in these conversations. Pride Month really invites us to talk about inclusive language, inclusive practices, and things that we can do to better the ways we communicate in order to allow everyone space at the table and to be accepted. You know, I was reading an article recently, it was an opinion piece by a linguistics professor, kind of talking about the limitations of inclusive language to actually affect change. And it was an interesting piece from a linguist's perspective, right? But inherent in the writer's perspective was this feeling that we turn to inclusive language. We use these phrases like houselessness, or instead of homelessness, unhoused persons, excuse me, right? I struggle, I try to be better with everyone else. But we do that because of some misguided desire to be right or be smarter or self-righteous. And I just thought that missed the point entirely. You know, when we talk about inclusive language, we talk about these practices, we talk about being better, we're talking about honoring the dignity in each other. You know, I don't do this work to be woke, I do it to be kind. And it struck me so deeply, Pauli's perspective on this as a moral question, as a responsibility we have to come from that righteous place to be better with each other. And I think that's absolutely what keeps us going, even with some really difficult situations and contexts that we face.
Absolutely. Well, great. Well said. What about you, Dean? What was your reaction to the film? Did you see yourself? Is there a little Pauli Murray in you?
Beth, thank you so much. And first of all, thank you very much for having me take part in this wonderful panel and asking me to view the film. I was blown away by it. I had the same reaction that my illustrious co-panelists had. I did not know a lot of the things that I learned from watching the video. And so that's, I think, the best kind of documentary, right? Where we could walk away and say to ourselves, I learned a lot from watching that film. And so I view myself as having a tremendous debt to Pauli Murray, to Dr. Murray. I am a somewhat gender nonconforming, openly gay lawyer, professor, law professor, and law school dean, in large part thanks to her and thanks to the evolutions in law that her brilliance sparked. The other thing that I will say, in going back to Justice Yu's comments about language and the footnote or footnotes, I was struck by how Dr. Murray kept talking about the power of language. And there were several moments throughout the video where I took notes, and one of them was how she said, let me see if I could find it here, quote, "one person plus one typewriter constitutes a movement." She also said that that in being challenged about why it was that she was so peripatetic in her career, right? I mean, she was a poet, an activist, a lawyer, a priest, etc. She said, it's all about language. It's all about words. It's all about how we communicate with one another in order to make the world fairer for everybody, right? And so that led me to think, you know, what my takeaway is from that logic is that as leaders, and this goes back to our DEI focus, as leaders, what we really need to do more of is listen to the people that we serve. Listen to the language that they use. Listen to the logic that they are expressing. Sometimes it might be expressed in ways that we have not yet heard, but that may be a revelation. And the other thing that she said that I loved so much was about the radicalism of some ideas eventually turning out to be workaday, common sense, taken for granted notions.
Right.
So,
she says, I've lived long enough to see some of my lost causes found.
Yes, exactly. So,
well, let's jump into this
I was actually
idea.
blown away. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's jump into this idea around language. One of the threads that carried through all of Pauli Murray's work was this idea or this challenge that they had about boundaries between people, whether those were boundaries based on race or sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And Pauli really, I think, comes to the conclusion that all those boundaries are essentially arbitrary, that they're kind of made up divisions. And one of the insights in the film was that perhaps it was because Pauli crossed so many of those lines in their own personal life that Pauli was in a better position perhaps to give us some insight into how to build solutions. So that, of course, leads Pauli to, in their scholarship, to recognize that the Fourth Amendment contains in it this promise of equal protection under the law, and that these are the ideas of their own time, like separate but equal, no blacks or women on juries, limited rights for women, that all of that was really based on a belief of these boundaries and the limitations that the law was putting around people who, at the end of the day, were all people, all entitled to equal dignity and respect. So I want to ask this group, in the work that Pauli was pushing forward and now coming to realize, you know, after their death, that Pauli was also experiencing what today we might define as a non-binary gender identity or gender expression, neither fitting into a male or a female gender definition. What do people think? Are we making any progress in breaking down those boundaries around these different classifications? Are we making any progress to break down arbitrary divisions today?
Well, I can jump in on this and share a little bit from the perspective of what we're doing within the Ninth Circuit. You know, the short answer is yes, because we have to, right? Identity is more fluid. We have employees coming, participants in our legal system from a wider variety and of diverse backgrounds, perspectives, ways of presenting, ways of self-identifying, ways of being in the world. So we have to acknowledge this. Otherwise, I mean, we lose our credibility, our ability to actually do our work. You know, in the Ninth Circuit, the point I wanted to make is, you know, both as an employer, right? We employ about 6,000 people in the circuit. That's not a small number. And also as a public serving institution, what are we doing? So on the employer front, right, creating inclusive workplaces, getting comfort around practices like sharing pronouns on our Zooms and in general, understanding what may lead someone to use a singular they, right? Having those conversations, that training, that understanding. Also, the Administrative Office of the Courts has updated our onboarding forms from an HR perspective to now create an opportunity to say non-binary or neither male nor female. I mean, these are some significant things for.
You're speaking of like a job application?
No, I'm speaking of like once you come on board, like your onboarding HR, like our processes, you know, being able to update that so we can make space and acknowledge the value that our non-binary employees have and bring and are able for them to be their non-binary selves, right? So
what is pushing the Ninth Circuit to be a leader in this area?
I mean, I think in part, we are seeing increasing numbers of non-binary externs and law clerks and even employees further along, right? It's the reality. And I do think there is also, look, I have been routinely impressed by my colleagues in the Ninth Circuit in terms of how thoughtful people are about it. You know, I know you have Judge Kasubai's article about pronouns and privilege as one of the materials here, but I mean, that's just an example of, I think, how our judges, how our court leadership, and how our employees are thinking about these issues and, you know, trying to do better and, again, create those inclusive spaces. And you'll see that translates into sort of the policy level with judges having standing orders, which invite people who participate in their systems to self-identify. Tell me your pronouns, tell me your honorifics, help me make sure that you are respected in my courtroom, right? That is a big shift we're seeing.
For those in the audience who may not know what Amrita is speaking about, when the email came out with the Zoom invitation, it included some CLE materials, because this is CLE credit after all, so we have to do your reading on pronouns and some standing orders. And there is a beautiful article I would encourage you to read by the Honorable Mustafa Kasubai, and he wrote, and I want to share this bit, he wrote that he realized that many of the people must have appeared in front of him anxious or fearful that their gender identity, if it didn't conform to that which they believed I expected, him writing, would be met with severe consequences, such as higher sentence or fine, a loss of custody, reduced parenting time, a snide remark, or at least a disapproving look. How has Judge Kasubai's article landed? What's been the reaction among the judges in the Ninth Circuit?
Like I said, I think there has been enthusiasm. I think there's been, I mean, that article has been shared widely, not just by myself, I should add, right? Like there is, and there have been requests nationwide for access to the standing orders or to see what can that language look like? How can that be implemented? And Judge Kasubai recently did a talk with the Berkeley Judicial Institute where he listed, I think, 10 different things, actionable items that he is doing to build inclusivity within his practices. So I think, again, sharing that as a resource, creating the opportunity for conversations and giving people an opportunity to engage with these issues. People perhaps had the privilege to never think about this, but now we're saying, please do, let's take this seriously. Let's move forward in a way that honors what everyone needs from us.
You talked about thinking about it, and that brings me back to Pauli Murray. I think that one of the ways that Pauli Murray really led us as a legal scholar was to think bigger, right? For instance, Pauli rejects the idea that was at the time being considered of how can we make separate more equal. And she says, you know, no, we're not going to have any school that segregates Black kids from white kids can never be equal. Because inherent in the separation of schools is the messages to Black children that you are not equal, you are not fully human, you have less dignity. So she pushes back there. Another example was there was at the time a question of whether Black men should be let on juries. And Pauli says, well, what about women? If we're going to talk about bringing people onto juries, then let's bring everybody onto juries. It reminded me when I was at the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force back in the early 90s, we were in the conference room and a bunch of Lambda legal lawyers piled into the conference room. And they said that they had this new idea and they wanted to go out and attain legal marriage for same-sex couples. And we all just essentially laughed. We thought that that was, myself included, just that that was preposterous. The idea in the early 90s that we could ever have access to legal marriage. And at the very same conference room, I also was present when we debated as national leaders whether or not we should cut the transgender community out of our push for equality, under the idea that it was going to be harder for transgender people to be accepted, and that if we gays and lesbians could just get to the front of the line and get our rights first, that maybe progress would be made. It's ironic that ultimately decisions like the Bostock decision come out of a recognition of the rights of transgender employees over and above gay or lesbian employees. So, you know, how wrong we were to think so small. So my question for you is, for all of you, is what are the big ideas today that are interesting you in the area of human rights, and what are you working on what are your big ideas? Justice Yu, do you want to start?
Sure. You know, I tend to have conversations with scholars or prior judges in my own mind. And so I have to admit, after this film, what I'm hearing from Paulie is, well, and I say that because it's a real call to action, and it's a call to dismantle the structures that continue to perpetuate, right, racism, bigotry, all the hatred that just piles up and really then creates the silos and disempowers us. So for me, the most significant issue today is racism, is dismantling racism against Black people. That to me is the #1 priority, and we can trace it throughout our country. I think the promise of democracy is not fulfilled until, right, Black Americans not only have reparations, but true equal footing and opportunity. And I would say our court as well has tried to be a leader. In June of 2020, what some people think is sort of a radical step that the court took was really a call to the legal community to examine ourselves, right? What is it that we're doing to contribute to this ongoing structure that perpetuates racism? And what is it that we're going to do to take on the mission of eradicating it? So I think the lens that we've put on is one I hope that will be permanent. For me, that means everything. That is the agenda, if you will, of a justice system, is to really take it on, speak boldly, and do everything that we can to empower those to seek power and to bring about change.
And it's hard to move these institutions as quickly as we might like, isn't that right?
It's hard, but you know, when you're a decision maker, it's not just about the personnel forms. And I've got to say, I got to give the Ninth Circuit a lot of credit, but you know, it really means personal conversion for us. It means to take this on and bring it to decision making. It's not an academic exercise. This is real. These are real people. We own the system that we've created, and we've got to redesign it.
Absolutely. Dean Varona, where do we go from here in our pursuit of human rights and equal protection under the law?
Well, I must start off by saying, Beth, that moving here from Florida, and I'm just incredibly excited about so many aspects of this new job and leading this wonderful law school, Seattle U Law. But one of the things that makes me most happy about this move is coming into a state that has Justice Mary Yu on the Supreme Court, and so it's because of what she just said and how she shared it and the passion with which she speaks. It actually reminds me of, and you had said something earlier, Beth, too, that reminded me of a quote that I found from Dr. Murray around how we really need to think boldly and not take for granted the injustice that we see with our own eyes day after day. And so one of the things that they said was, quote, "When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. Where they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind," unquote. So it's very interesting that I keep finding this language that Dr. Murray produced that really is at the confluence of their identity as lawyer, as poet, and as priest, right? And so that language put it so beautiful, put what we've been talking about so very beautifully, and what Justice Yu just said so eloquently in a really proper frame, that we need to think boldly. We need to make sure that we are not taking for granted what we have been seeing for years and years, thinking that it's just not possible to fix it. Like years ago, just like you, Beth, I was sitting in the conference rooms at the Human Rights Campaign and other conference rooms where we would have lawyers come to us saying, we have to bring marriage equality cases. And I saw so many colleagues saying to us, this is ridiculous. This is a loser when we don't even have the right protected under law to be out in the workplace. How can we possibly go for marriage equality? And look at what happened. We ended up getting nationwide marriage equality thanks to those test cases before we even got Bostock. So
right.
finally,
we lived in a world where you could go get married and then come back to work on Monday and
be fired on it, right? Because we got married. So going back to your very specific question, I think that if Dr. Murray were alive today, she would applaud what Justice Yu just said, and she would add, what are we doing about homelessness? What are we doing about access to healthcare? What are we doing about access to mental health care, right? I mean, one of the things that the film did so beautifully is tell us about her own struggles with mental health that were rooted in the oppression that she faced. What are we doing about the housing crisis, poverty, et cetera, et cetera? Are we just taking them for granted as realities of life? Or are we tackling them very strategically, which is what she also talked about a lot? Strategic thinking, strategic work, not just taking failures as givens, but take failures as challenges to do even more.
Amrita, would you want to weigh in on this? What is the future of human rights? What would Pauli Murray think about the progress that we've made so far and where we're going?
I mean, is it enough to just co-sign what my eminent panelists have said? This is exactly right.
That was my plan, absolutely.
Right? Look, the focus too on inclusion, I think, Beth, your point about when we did find a way to support the rights of transgender employees, it benefited everyone. Like, it's that rising tide that lifts all boats, right? And I think the Bostock story is also really apt. I was at the EEOC at the time when there were a lot of discussions about, can we advance this Price Waterhouse theory of sex stereotyping to include sexual orientation and identity? And I mean, there was a lot of back and forth and the same conversations. This is dead in the water. We need to go through legislative action with the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. Like, and remember that work,
which is still not passed.
Yeah, it's still not passed.
Yeah, I know, right? So, and I think one thing I do want to share in terms of, I hope it provides a little bit of hope. Fast forward 10 years, and it happens. And the EEOC does coalesce again for this strategy, puts it forward to the Supreme Court, and now we have presidential case law finding rights for everyone under Title VII. And that's, I think, remarkable, possible. We definitely weren't thinking broadly enough. And again, in the span of just 10 years, that has shifted tremendously. Right. Not that long.
Beth, may I quickly drop a footnote here too and say that
everybody's footnoting. I guess it's what the cool kids do.
I know, yes, Justice Yu inspired us to think in terms of footnotes, thanks to the love of language that Dr. Murray instilled in all of us. But one of the things that I was just thinking about, Beth, back to what you were saying about how some years ago, and frankly, we are still facing this energy within the broader LGBTQ plus movement to distance ourselves away from, and I'm talking about an openly, from my perspective as an openly gay man, right? Mm-hmm. That there's been this tension with our transgender brothers and sisters, right? And so there were many of us back then who I think were saying things that Dr. Murray would have said, which would have been that it would be the transgender community that actually will lead us towards the promised land of employment non-discrimination protection under the Civil Rights Act. So why in the world would we distance them? So think in terms of what is the morally right thing to do, which is transgender inclusion, right? But also, what is the strategically correct thing to do, which is also transgender inclusion, right? So it is very interesting that her thinking, her philosophy, her theorizing actually turned out to prove correct in what happened with Bostock, and having gender and because of sex be the tool through which, thanks to Paulie's incredible theorizing so long ago, to draw that circle in a much broader way that ended up including everybody, rather than thinking of ourselves as the G's and the L's and the T. Everybody got brought into that circle.
No more puny circles.
No
Ever.
more puny circles, to
Right.
borrow her language. Exactly.
So the nub, like the kernel, the idea that Pauli Murray had was, if we are what we say, what we claim to be, then equal protection under the law means equal protection for all humans. And that idea then is what Thurgood Marshall uses, is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg uses during Paulie's lifetime. And then after Paulie has passed away, it transforms into the right to abortion, birth control, decriminalization of gay relationships, equal access to marriage and employment, gays in the military. Even the Americans with Disabilities Act has its start with these ideas about equal protection under the law. Really an incredible amount of progress. At the same time, as I think everyone on this panel has acknowledged, we are living in hard times. Judge Martinez began our session today recognizing that we are in a period where it may feel like we're moving backwards. I mean, May 25th marked 2 years since the police murdered George Floyd, and yet we're living in a time of the rise of the visibility of white supremacy. June 15th will be 2 years since the Bostock decision, frankly, a decision Pauli Murray themselves could have written word for word. I mean, it was literally Paulie's words. And yet we are now in a position where there are, I think, something like 230 different state legislation bills that are trying to remove rights including, don't say gay education bills, gender affirming medical care, equals child abuse, anti-trans sports bills. And so there is this sense of grief, of fear, of despair, of concern. And my question for the panel, for those who are watching, and there are a lot of people who have turned in today, over 300 people have joined us today for this conversation, which I think is incredible because it touches on so many of our lives. But the question really I would ask for you all to answer is, what do we say to our young people who are watching this backlash and feeling despair or anger or fear today? Justice, do you want to tackle that one first?
Sure. I guess I'd like to say two things, and maybe it's to two different audiences. So to the young that you mentioned, or to people who will inherit what we have given them, I'd say don't give up, because you're right. Be righteous, be indignant. You are right. That's the most important thing, right? It is hard work, but we're right. And that's really important. But I'd also like to say something to those who hold power, to, frankly, a white community who doesn't want to move over and let some of us move in. You can paint our court as the ideal looking court, but it's hard. It's hard for established people to move over and let new voices be heard. And I'd say all of us who've been in institutions, right, our responsibility to the next generation is to promise them that we're going to move, and their voice will be heard, and they will take over, and they will take power, and we have to let them do that. And that's where hope lies. right? Because there's room for the voice, there's room for differences, there's room for somebody to challenge us to even do more and be better than we could ever possibly do or be. That to me is where hope lies. That's why I hang in here, because I owe it to them.
Paulie said in the documentary that they're also a poet, says, hope is the song in a weary heart. And is there a historical lens that can help us make sense of what is happening now in this country?
Might I offer? Yes, might I offer that the film kept reminding me of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s beautiful expression, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And when he spoke about that expression, he made clear that one of the things that he meant was that setbacks and backlashes and potholes on this road, this arc of the moral universe, are to be expected, and they are signs of progress. We would not be facing backlashes. We would not be facing pushbacks. We would not be facing detours if we were not making significant progress. And history shows that that is the case. If we look at the racial civil rights movement, if we look at the women's movement, if we look at the LGBTQ plus movement, with marriage equality, with employment discrimination, with service in the military, I can cite for you example after example of how we achieved formal equality in each of those metrics after facing severe and very serious backlashes for years and years and years. We don't have time for me to go through each of them with you, but
you have to sign up for your class for that. Yeah.
And so I would keep that in mind, and I would also remind us of what Paulie also said. This is another of my favorite quotes of theirs. Quote, "Don't get mad, get smart." Mm-hmm. And I think in part what she meant is know our history in order to strategize forward so that we could achieve the best and quickest progress possible.
Well, let's talk a little bit about emotion, right? You talked about getting mad, but what about fear? What isn't there fear that's fueling this backlash? I mean, there are many people who feel very strongly that we need to have boundaries between men and women, and have respect for religious belief in order to hold our society together. What can we say to them? Amrita, can you field this one?
Yeah, no, and thank you for that really thoughtful question, Beth. I think we miss out if we don't take into account the fear that is underlying this. And we are asking people to really alter at a fundamental level their conception of the world and of themselves. And that can be a big ask. And, even on a very small scale, right? If I'm facilitating a conversation in the courts about using gender pronouns, and there's hesitation there, there's a discomfort. And, I think there's a real opportunity to explore that and go deeper and say, well, why is that? Let's work on that together. Let's acknowledge it. Let's not shame it. Let's not blame it, but really that needs to come to the forefront. And then, I think someone just put into the chat the importance of educating ourselves about, I think Dean Varona beat me to it, but Carrie's comment about really understanding the perspectives of everyone from that place of recognizing our mutual human dignity is critical. But you can't get there without holding space for fear, for uncertainty, and for some of the harder stuff that holds us back. When we do try to ignore that or march forward, the backlash continues, or we end up being increasingly polarized. And I think the goal is to find ways to better understand each other so we can all move forward together.
Justice Chu, I'm going to give you the last word in our final moments here. What can members of the audience do to carry forward Pauli Murray's legacy of respect for human dignity?
Wow. Well, frankly, share the film, because it opens up so many possibilities. The best thing we can all do is, gosh, Amrita, you just said it so well right now, is get everybody to recognize that it is a scary place. And this film, it takes us to that place, but in a very comforting way, that there is a way to move forward. There is a path, and there are many possibilities. I wish I could say more, but I think that's what I'm just struck with.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to the Ninth Circuit Historical Society for hosting this wonderful event. If you haven't already seen it, please go out tonight and watch the movie. My name is Pauli Murray. I'm going to hand it back to Cynthia Jones now, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to our brilliant panelists. What a thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. And I echo Beth's call to go and watch the documentary if you haven't already. And thanks also to our audience members and their thoughtful comments in the chat. I would like to just take a moment to let you know that you can find more information and links to how to see the documentary at the Ninth Judicial Historical Society website. And with that, thank you again to our panelists, and that concludes today's presentation.